Welcome. My name is Ruth Langer, and I'm professor of Jewish Studies and direct the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. It is our privilege to host this webinar on the Holocaust-Era archives of Pope Pius XII, the state of the question. This public program introduces an invitational scholars conference that will take place Monday and Tuesday, and all three parts of this program are co-sponsored with the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. This conference will be exploring the contributions of Catholic archives at the Vatican and elsewhere to Holocaust memory. We very much thank our co-sponsors, the conference participants, and the behind-the-scenes folks here at Boston College, especially the center's associate director, Dr. Camille Markey, and our tech expert, Sam Jai. First, some business matters. This program is being recorded, and it will be available on our websites and YouTube channels in a few days. Because this is a webinar, we ask that participants raise questions for our panel in the chat, but the chat is to address things to the panel. I don't believe that it is available for chat among the various participants. So please send your questions to all panelists. Our plan for today is as follows. We will first have a few words of welcome from Dr. Rebecca Carter-Chand, Director of Programs on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Then, to level the playing field, we will turn briefly to some basic background about archives and the Vatican archives in particular. Our main event will follow that, a panel conversation among several leading scholars whose work uses the newly opened Vatican archives to understand the pontificate of Pope Pius XII. I will introduce them in a bit, but for now, Rebecca.
Thank you, Ruth, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Carter-Chand, and I am the director of the Programs on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And on behalf of my colleagues at the USHMM, I want to thank you for participating in today's webinar. The topic of the Vatican archives related to the pontificate of Pius XII clearly resonates with a lot of people, and we are so pleased to offer public programming about the ongoing research being done and the larger questions that these archives raise for all of us. We often talk about the importance of rigorous scholarly research, which is a long-term investment, given the massive amount of documents in these archives and the complex nature of the Catholic Church. Over the next several years, the Holocaust Museum will be making digital scans of portions of these archives accessible in Washington and supporting scholars doing this research through workshops and conferences like the one taking place this week. If you are someone who is interested in conducting research in the Vatican archive materials, please stay in touch with us and watch out for upcoming opportunities. But we are also committed to engaging wider audiences, survivors and their families, Holocaust educators, theologians, clergy, and really anyone interested in these issues that have universal resonance, like how religious institutions perceive their role during societal crises, local dynamics between religious majorities and minorities before, during, and after times of war and upheaval, and the role of clergy in shaping the behavior of ordinary people. And to foster these sorts of discussions and make the latest findings accessible beyond academic circles, the USHMM works with many institutions, universities, and individual scholars who approach this material from different perspectives, from diplomatic history to theology to Jewish-Christian relations. And it's been wonderful to work with our colleagues at Yad Vashem and Boston College on this program. And I want to thank our esteemed panelists and all who were involved in organizing this event. And now back to you, Ruth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I want to begin with a basic question. What are archives and why are the Vatican archives important? Many of you know answers to these questions, but not everybody. So why have controversies been swirling around these archives? Archives are storage places for the raw data of history. My desk drawer archives family history. Many Americans visit the National Archives in Washington reverently to view the country's founding documents, but much else is there too. The Vatican's huge archives reside in a complex of buildings in Rome, housing everything saved during the 4 centuries since its founding. Professional archivists catalog these materials so that the contents may be accessed, but they also regulate who has access and what may be made public. At any archive, new materials are frequently embargoed, not made available for a period of time, often for matters of privacy. Vatican archives on principle generally open only 70 years after the close of a pontificate. Now, normally, this wouldn't create controversy. However, in 1963, Rolf Hochhuth published a play called The Deputy that accused Pope Pius XII of failing to act to save the Jews during the Holocaust. The pontificate, I see someone asked in the chat, is the period where a certain pope reigns. So this, play coming a few years after Pius's death in 1958 was the opening salvo of what our panelist Robert Ventresca has described as a kind of eternal Pius war, the polarized debate between competing versions of Pius XII as a good, even saintly man, doing everything within his power to defend human life and work for peace against enormous odds, or conversely, as a morally timorous and politically ineffective religious leader whose cautious diplomatic approach to the Nazi racial war played directly into Hitler's murderous hands. I should add that the newly open discourse between Jews and Catholics in the 1960s encouraged demands for access to the facts locked away in these archives that were scheduled to be opened only in 2028, decades away still when the Pius Wars began. Today, after a pandemic-induced, rather stuttering start in March 2020, these archives are open. Let us turn now to a brief recorded interview with one of the Vatican's archivists, Mr. Piero Doria. The interviewer is Boston College history professor, Father Charles Gallagher of the Society of Jesus. This will provide some helpful background for those of you unfamiliar with the workings of an archive and of this archive in particular.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this video presentation and interview. We have with us today Dr. Piero Doria, who is an assistant archivist at the Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archives. Piero has worked at the Vatican Apostolic Archives for 22 years, and we're grateful to him to have him join us today for this video presentation, where Piero will read some brief opening remarks, and then I will ask Piero some questions which he will answer.
The opening consultation of the archive concerning the pontificate of Pius XII, 1939-1958, particularly weighted by the whole scientific world, was announced by Pope Francis on March 4, 2019 for March 2, 2020. Then Pope Francis accompanied this important decision, the opening of the archive of Pius XII, with the following words: "The Church is not afraid of history. On the contrary, she loves it and would like to love it more and better, as God loves it. So, with the same confidence as my predecessors, I open and entrust this documentary heritage to researchers." Regarding the pontificate of Pius XII, In addition to the Vatican Apostolic Archive, we must remember the opening of other archives. Began in 2006. It was a long and meticulous job that involved most of the scientific staff of the Central Archives of the Holy See, and which had as its object the reorganization, arrangement, and editing of important research tools of over 120 funds and series for a total of up to 20,000 archival units and millions of pages. We are talking about at least 15 million pages. Unfortunately, as is known, after a few days of opening the archives, was forced to close its doors for a few months. Like all other institutions of this type, archives, libraries, museums, due to the explosion of the COVID-19 pandemic, effects that, although in a more attenuated form, still persist today, with a reduced presence of scholars admitted, only 25. It is not necessary to point out the importance of Pacelli's pontificate. The most controversial question of the pontificate is connected to Pius XII and the Jews. Obviously, the documentation of the Vatican Apostolic Archives for some subjects need to be integrated with the papers conserved in other archives of the Holy See. Through the papers of pontifical diplomacy, it is possible to study and know what the attitude of the Pope and his closest collaborators was towards the great issues, as just to give some example of fascism, Nazism, communism, the Holocaust. Obviously, what has been presented briefly is only a very small part of the documentation that can be found in the Vatican Apostolic Archives and in the other archives of the Holy See. Scholars have the task of valuing with competence and intellectual honesty what the popes and the Vatican have preserved and now made available to researchers.
My name is Father Charles Gallagher. I am a Jesuit of the Jesuit community at Boston College and an associate professor in the history department at Boston College. Could you describe a typical day at the Apostolic Archives? What is your routine and what does an archivist there do?
I can answer this question for myself. In fact, each archivist has his own task, which he carries out independently on the basis of the directives received. I am currently in charge of reviewing the entire inventory that I have drawn up of the archives of the Second Vatican Council in view of the next publication.
Do you live nearby the Vatican?
I live with my family, wife, and 2 children in a Vatican house not far from the Vatican State.
How do you make decisions about what is kept and what is thrown away?
At the moment, I have always kept everything. I have never operated a vast. The policy of the office, the archive, in fact, is to keep all the documents that are given to the Vatican Apostolic Archives.
Could you please explain the structure of the Apostolic Archives of the Vatican? Is there more than one archive, or are Vatican archives housed in different places? Are they all in the same building, or is the Apostolic Archive housed separately from the Diplomatic Archive?
All the documents are kept in the deposit of the archive.
And could you please explain how scholars gain access to the archives?
To access and consult the archive, it is necessary for laymen of a university degree or equivalent university degree or PhD, and for clergymen, a licentiate degree or PhD. After, it is necessary to send an application to the prefect of the archive, providing personal details and the reasons for the research. And finally, a presentation letter from a recognized institute of scientific and historical research or a person qualified in the field of historical research.
I understand that the demand has been high this COVID, and that the 25 available seats per day are full through 2021 and the first half of 2022. What advice do you have for researchers to obtain one of these coveted spaces?
The advice I can give is to follow the updates of the archive site.
And what about the size of the collection? Was there ever any pressure to get the collection cataloged? How was the Pius XII collection different from the cataloging of the Pope Pius XI collection, which was released in 2006?
The external pressures are evidently always there, but the archive, respecting the will of the Holy Father, always acts independently of the pressures. The two archives are obviously both very important for different reasons. The difference is evidently in the quantity of documents that with Pius XII are much more numerous.
Well, thank you very much for answering these questions for us, Piero Doria. We are grateful for your time and your expertise, and we wish you every best wish in continuing your work at the Apostolic Archives of the Vatican. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are now going to turn to our panels of scholars who have actually had the opportunity to work with these archives. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Iael Nidam-Orvieto. She's director of the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and she teaches at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her own Holocaust-era research focuses on Italian Jews, Jewish responses, the Vatican, and rescue attempts. The panelists themselves are, in no particular order, Dr. Suzanne Brown-Fleming, Director of International Academic Programs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. Her current research project is a study of Pope Pius XII's relationship to Germany and its bishops, leaders, and people during the Weimar era, the Third Reich, and the Holocaust. She is joining us today, as I understand it, from Abu Dhabi on her way back from spending several weeks in Rome. David I. Kertzer is the Paul Dupee University Professor of Social Science at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, where he is also Professor of Anthropology and Italian Studies. He's widely known for his many publications about Italian Jews and the Vatican based on archival research. He was among the first scholars granted access to the Vatican archives of Pope Pius XII. His article in The Atlantic in August 2020 followed shortly thereafter by a footnoted version in Studies in Christian-Jewish Relations, offered the first major findings to come out of the newly open archives. He's currently working on a book on the interactions of Pius XII, Mussolini, and Hitler during the Second World War. And finally, Robert Ventresca is Professor of History at King's University College at Western University in London, Ontario, and serves on the Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. His work focuses on the role that religion and religious institutions play in historical conflicts and their aftermaths, with a focus on the Catholic Church in the Holocaust and the post-Holocaust eras. This includes his 2013 biography of Pius XII. His current project on the Vatican and the Holocaust will incorporate newly available documentation from the Vatican archives. So let me now turn our virtual floor over to our panel. Iael.
Thank you, Ruth. So I will start already with throwing some questions to our panelists, to my colleagues, and we will see how the discussion will develop. We are talking this evening about a very controversial topic about Pius XII that left an open controversy about his activity during the Holocaust. And I would like to hear shortly each one of you What is, in your opinion, the main controversy that still needs to be discussed, that still needs to be researched? What is the topic that we are still trying to understand better? And maybe we'll start with David, please.
I think the main controversy for me is the Vatican official statement about the Holocaust, which is "we remember" in the late 1990s, which had very high profile, prepared after 11 years of study by the Commission for Catholic-Jewish Relations. And the Pope himself, John Paul II, wrote the introduction to a presentation of, and basically it claimed that the long centuries of demonization of Jews in Europe by the church and by Christianity, not just the Catholic Church, essentially bore no relationship to the anti-Semitism that led to and enabled the Holocaust to take place. And the church, even though some national churches, most recently the German church, but also the French church and other Catholic church national groups, have basically admitted that in fact one cannot make this kind of distinction, the Vatican has held on to it. So from my point of view, in terms of one overarching issue, coming to terms, the Pope Francis was quoted as saying the church loved the history and wanted to confront it for better or worse. There's no time like the present with the opening of these archives for that finally to take place.
Thank you. Suzanne, please.
As you said, I've just come from 3 weeks in the archives in Rome, and it's my third long stint taking a look at the Vatican Apostolic Archive, Congregation of Doctrine of Faith, spent some time in the Archive for Oriental Churches as well. And I find myself wondering the more I read, if we shouldn't be reframing the entire question we're asking. I say this based on a document I was looking at last week, and it was in the Archive for Congregation of Doctrine of Faith, the former Holy Office. There was an episode in 1944 where a French Capuchin priest, whose name will be familiar to some of you, Marie Benoit, who's been, he is a righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem, and was involved in rescuing both Catholics persecuted as Jews and Jews themselves. He was very active in 1943 in Italy in this regard, and also prior to that in France. So I was looking through a folder and found this really interesting episode in 1944, December 1944, where the Holy Office had caught wind that Father Benoit was going to have an academic conference in Rome in dialogue with his Jewish brethren about the Old Testament. And the Holy Office flagged it and said, well, wait a minute, you shouldn't be doing this, because in 1928, that was forbidden. And there was a long exchange back and forth, but I guess I'm just going to share 2 sentences from one of the response of the Holy Office to the issue of, are Catholics allowed to have what we would today consider dialogue conversations with Jewish partners in 1944? And the response was that Father Benedict, now recognized as righteous among the nations, quote, compromises the supernatural field of faith. In order to material and morally favor the Jews, he endangers the spiritual good of both Jews and Catholics. Because both Jews and Catholics, seeing religious problems of such gravity treated by a Catholic priest exclusively according to the Old Testament, they will think one testament is worth the other. That's, to boil it down, the Holy Office said this is not allowed because Catholicism has superseded Judaism, and we're not supposed to be in these kinds of dialogues. That is a long way of saying, we keep asking ourselves, was the church anti-Semitic at the time? Was its teaching anti-Semitic? I think we know the answer is yes, because we had not yet reached Nostra Aetate and Vatican II. Now, given that that was the context in which we're asking all of these important questions about so many key events of the Holocaust, it's remarkable to me when there were so many gray areas, and remarkable how rescue did take place and what dynamics were there and what kind of theological messaging was behind action and inaction. So I just wonder, I think we've been too simple. I think we need to be much more looking at the gray areas.
Thank you. Robert, please.
Thank you. I mean, it won't be surprised to know that I agree and I share both David and Suzanne's interests and questions. I guess, I'll just to add a different take on it. I think that, of all of the unsettled questions for which we already have some answers, the one that I think continues to persist, I think the reason why we can continue to talk about a controversy really can be boiled down to a few essential questions that are kind of interconnected. Basically, what did the Vatican know about the systematic mass murder of Jews in the Second World War? When did the Vatican know it? And the most important and the most consequential of the questions and the real source of the controversy is why did the Vatican choose essentially to remain silent about it? Now, that word silent, and I write about this in my biography, has to be qualified because there were many statements and there was intervention and so forth. But I think we understand, and I think this is a settled question, that there was an intentional and a deliberate choice made by Pius XII and by his inner circle to effectively avoid naming victims and naming perpetrators in very explicit ways. And so the path that's chosen is the path of diplomatic caution and influence and so forth. I think the whole of the debate over Pius XII hinges on how we judge that choice. And it's a choice that again, to me is clear, it was deliberated, it was intentional. And there's two movements, because one of it is a historical judgment, a historical analysis, but then quickly followed is the moral judgment, right? Because I think implicated in all of this is the question, not just of what did the Pope do, but what do we think the leader of the world's most powerful religious institution should have done in a time of war and extreme humanitarian crisis, and of course what we now understand to be genocide. So I think that question will perennially be, and I don't think it has an easy answer, but I think that's perhaps at the heart of the so-called controversy.
Thank you, all three of you, for very interesting insights. I would like to ponder on, in one of his essays, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz said that when we study something new, we should try to put aside part of our previous knowledge and views in order to absorb the new knowledge, because sticking to our views, he argued, makes it hard to advance our learning. And when we talk about a controversial issue such as the Vatican and Pius XII during the Holocaust, I asked myself to what extent our previous opinion on this issue can influence our study of the new documentation that was recently opened, and what are the challenges that scholars are facing when working on such a controversial topic, and to what extent this controversy influences the scholar's work. And finally, I would like to ask, can we or should we put aside our previous views when coping with this new documentation? And maybe Rob, would you like to start with this question?
It's a great question, and I think, I mean, we teach our students all the time, of course, that they should never be, one has to be, stand for your views and your perspectives, but be always open to revise them, especially if the evidence leads you to, one of the hallmarks of critical thinking and the use of evidence and logical reasoning and so forth. So I think it's a general rule of thumb that we should always be prepared to revise our interpretations. I'm mindful of time, and there's so much here and so many layers. A lot of the challenges, I think, in some cases, one of the things we may need to be prepared not to have our conclusions revised. We may need to be prepared not to find anything especially, and I'll be careful how I say this, anything especially sort of revelatory. What we may find in these archives is a lot of information about a very long pontificate that goes from 1939 to 1958. But vis-a-vis the question of the Holocaust specifically, it may be that we find ourselves affirming conclusions that were made even decades ago, and I'll expand on one of those perhaps in a few minutes. I do think that we've got to be mindful of a few other challenges. I think one of them is this. And then there's clearly a tension between the moral judgment and the historical judgment, and I'm not suggesting that historians and scholars shouldn't be engaged in moral judgment, but I think it's Simon Schama who said recently that historians are in the business of truth telling, right? And so I think that our primary focus should be getting at the truth of this episode, this history, and then using that to inform the judgments that follow. I don't think moral judgment should predetermine the historical. And I think there's a danger that happened in a previous generation of scholarship. I think that there's a danger that it's going to happen again. And I think there's already evidence that can be happening. So we've got to be very careful not to let our historical work of reconstruction interpretation sort of conform to some predetermined conclusions. There's other things as well. I mean, there are some, I think we have to be very careful not to relitigate some of the debates of the past. That may be inevitable, but I think the Pius War, that tired debate about these sort of confronting images of the Pope it was unproductive. As I've said before, it created more heat than light, and I hope we don't relitigate some of those questions. We also have to, I think, expand the horizon. I mean, really what you're talking about here is looking at the intersection of two histories, right? Because there's the intersection of the history of the pontificate of Pius XII, which has its own history and is a part of the history of the papacy as an institution and of the Catholic Church. And then there's the history of the Holocaust, right? And those two histories intersect. And our judgment of the one, of course, is going to be influenced by our judgment of the Pope's role in the Holocaust. So, I mean, there are other issues I would say are challenges. I mean, some of them are methodological challenges. I think that was alluded to at the very start of our discussion. There's a world beyond the Vatican. The Catholic Church is not a monolithic institution. The Vatican is the center of power in Catholicism, but there are other centers of influence. There's a dynamic between the center and the periphery that has to be understood. And so, and finally, I would just, I want to challenge us on the archives themselves. I mean, archives are not an end in themselves. They're a means to an end. We've got to be mindful of not only what archives reveal, but what they conceal, intentionally or not. And we have to be mindful too to listen to the voices of marginalized and persecuted people who may not end up, in fact, rarely will end up in a lot of some of these formal archives. So there are again layers of complexity here, but I think that's just a hint of some of the problems that and the challenges we're facing.
Thank you, Rob. Maybe I will pass to the next question that I would like actually all of you to relate to it. Maybe this is the core question of this evening. If you could share with us some of the new findings from your own research in the new documentation in the Vatican archives. And I would like to hear if you believe that the new documentation change or will change some of your previous understanding of these topics. Did you find things that you were expecting to find, or maybe things that actually surprised you? And if so, in what way they were surprising? And maybe we'll start with Suzanne, that started earlier to mention already one of the documents. So maybe you can continue from this point, please.
I have to say, I think it's going to take 5 to 10 years of solid research, and I think many preconceptions we might have had will actually be blown open. There've just been, I've already come across things that puzzled me. In the same letter about Marie Benoit, he also talked about having an audience with Pope Pius XII in 1943 about his activities. So the Pope was fully informed of his rescue work. That's interesting. So what's that about when we unpack it? Another really fascinating thing that we came across relates to the famous Austrian Alois Hudal, the priest who helped Eichmann get to South America. In one folder about during the 1961 Adolf Eichmann trial, Hudal's name was coming up in the press as in a very negative way, as identified as having helped Eichmann escape. And in that same file is a letter from a Jewish survivor from Vienna saying, I'm reading what they're saying about you, and it's not true because you saved me at this hospital in Rome in 1943. And then in a different folder, we find the wife of Otto von Vester, the commandant of Warsaw, saying, "Thank you for holding my husband in his arms as he was trying to escape to Latin America in 1949. So this is not a, these are confusing archives. And just one more kind of story that I think we need to really engage theologians here. And I'll tell you why. I've done work decades ago on the Catholic clemency campaign for the war criminals prosecuted in Nuremberg. And the public language of that was always, in the name of Christian love and mercy and charity, we help everyone. That's what Iael said too in these papers, we help everyone. But in some of the documentation I'm seeing in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, who've been just terrific in their cooperation with us, there was also this fear and belief that Judaism was a religion of an eye for an eye, a Mosaic, vengeful religion that was driving, in the view of some Catholics in some very high offices, driving prosecution of German war criminals. It's very complicated. And I think we do need to try our best to put our preconceived notions aside. I don't think it'll be fully possible, but we do need to appreciate we're not gonna have quick answers, and we're not going to have too many clean heroes and too many complete villains, and we're going to have a lot of people in between that are very human and showed the entire range of human behavior.
Thank you, Suzanne. David, please.
Well, there's a lot here. These are all human people, but you know, most of the Jews of Europe were murdered in this period. And for, I'm sure, most of those murders, we can find many good things that they did. So, you know, let's keep that in mind. Well, saying that, though, I think, Rob, is certainly true that we have to be careful about distinguishing our moral judgments here from our historical work. And the historical work is really, should be around the question of understanding what was done and why it was done, as what influenced it. And the moral questions I think, can be held, should be held separate. This gets to kind of the combination of your two questions, Iael, that, you know, should we not have any preconceptions as we see this new material, and what are the surprises? So preconceptions, I mean, for a historian, the fact is we have to see these Vatican archives that have been newly opened in the context of many other archives that have often equally as valuable material for understanding what the Pope was doing and what the men around him were doing. They're almost all men. I've been working in the archives, in diplomatic archives in the US, in Britain, in France, in Germany. And all these places either had ambassadors or envoys at the Vatican City who were sending essentially daily reports throughout the war years back to their governments about their conversations with the Pope, or more, even more so with the Secretary of State and the men under the Secretary of State. And they are providing very valuable perspectives that need to be integrated. And I think that's what we're all trying to do, to integrate them with this new material. So in terms of preconceptions, you know, one thing that came to mind as I was in Italy waiting for the opening of the archives in February of 2020 in Rome, there was a whole series of major newspaper reports, basically part of the making a saint of Pius XII, even before the archives opened. One of them said, new archives are about to reveal how much the men of the fascist, the Italian fascist, the Nazi German regime struggled to prevent Pacelli from being elected as Pope. And, you know, this is, of course, total baloney, and you don't need the Vatican archives to tell you this, because you just have to go to the diplomatic archives of Germany and Italy to know that both were working to elect Pacelli to be Pope. So it's just one example of, you know, what's a preconception in going into these archives. Depends a bit on the question. In fact, I think there are surprises. On the one hand, I think I probably agree with Robert's at least implication that we already have a pretty good idea of what was going on, and that's unlikely to radically change. On the other hand, working with the thousands of documents I've been working with so far from these newly open archives, I know I've learned something I find shocking about the Pope's dealings with Hitler that have been kept secret by the Vatican for the past 82 years and only now will be coming to light. And then there are other more minor, perhaps, but the mention was made of the piece I wrote in The Atlantic last year on the Finley case, famous case of these two Jewish children who were taken in ultimately into Catholic convents and baptized against the family's wishes, and where they were hidden in various convents, and first in France, then in Spain, to be kept from the family that was trying to reclaim them after the war. And those newly opened archives allowed us to know something we didn't know before, even though this was a vastly publicized at the time, back in the early 50s episode. But that is what role the Pope and the Holy Office and the Secretary of State were playing behind the scenes, all the while giving as part of their instructions, whatever you do, don't let anybody know that these instructions are coming from the Vatican. So I think we're already learning quite a bit, and we'll keep discovering new things, I'm sure, for years to come.
And I just have to second what David said about these internal conversations at high levels. I think that's, and not just for the Pope and his top officers, but for nuncios, for the different bishops' conferences in Europe, for priests writing to their bishops. And we might know the outcome, but we don't know what those conversations were. We do know there was this context of a belief that Judaism was superseded by Christianity, and all kinds of negative beliefs about Jews that made the 6 million dead that David mentions either easier to participate in or easier to swallow. And I do think sussing out really carefully exactly what those conversations were is important, and it's going to take a lot of time.
Thanks. Rob, please.
Yeah, I agree very much with what Suzanne and David have said, just these last comments, especially this idea of the internal conversations. It's one of the things, I mean, we do have a lot of documentation. I mean, we've had that, those 11 volumes, the Actes Documents Essentiels, that we often are such a rich source. I continue to insist that they are underutilized, but they're incredibly rich. But what's missing, and this gets to what David and Suzanne are saying, is that that's where the gaps are. And there's a list of things. I have a list of in some cases, very specific documents I want to follow the paper trail on, because there's, for example, a corresponding a request made, there's an answer missing in the published sources. So we need to understand that's the process by which the Vatican was deciding and why it was doing what it was doing. That to me is going to be maybe the most interesting and the most important of the revelations, if you will. There's a lot of documents, as we all know, but the one that I'm working with right now that I will highlight is the work of the archival. It was called the Commissione Soccorsi, which is the Papal Relief Commission archives. In fact, I've got the inventory here. It's one of the cluster of sources that are of particular interest to me. So this is just sort of, I guess, how we should describe it. It's kind of an organizing body of what we would describe as humanitarian charitable efforts. I know humanitarian relief in that context is a bit of a loaded word, and there's a reason to use it with caution. But essentially, it operated for the whole of the pontificate of Pius XII, right? So it goes to 1958. There's a lot in there about the post-war transition. That's very, very important. So a couple of things, just, I mean, in terms of initial observations or findings, I would say at this point, nothing that I think surprises me yet, except two observations I guess I could share. One of them is that I'm reminded about just how enormous of an effort it actually was. And I don't say this is sort of to be praising the institution, it's simply to recognize a historical fact that there was a tremendous investment of time and resources and manpower in organizing these efforts, in coordinating this relief. So, and I don't think we've done nearly enough work on that action, that aspect of papal intervention. So it's a serious investment of time and resources and manpower. The second thing that's very obvious is that there is so little so far that I've seen, it's all very tentative, so little about what the sources call, concern for those who are persecuted for racial reasons. And those of us who work in these documents know that that's usually Vatican speak for Jews. I'm struck by just how much of the focus is on prisoners of war, especially military prisoners of war. And it almost in a way sort of, and again, this is very, very preliminary observation, but it's in some senses affirms something that my mentor, Michael Maris, Holocaust historian, said many, many years ago, which is in some senses, it's clear even in the humanitarian relief, that the plight of Jews was not a priority for the Vatican. It doesn't mean that it was ignored or that they were insensitive to it, but it's clearly not a priority. There's no sense, at least in anything that I've seen yet, of the urgency or the drama, the stakes, when of course information already has reached the Vatican that wholesale communities are being destroyed and the Jews are being targeted in a systematic and in a particular way, right? Something that's happening that's different from other dimensions of civilian casualties in war. So again, maybe it's work as will take a long time to develop fully, but so far it seems to be affirming perhaps something that we have already known.
Can I make just a quick point about that? Because it's one of my things on this topic. The Commissione Soccorsi documents, I see Sasha Hinkle just from University of Munster just popped in the chat. I think they're fascinating because mostly, not always, they dealt with Catholics who were persecuted as Jews by the Mussolini or Nazi regimes, but the church considered them Catholic. They were baptized and therefore worthy of consideration. And it's really interesting to compare in those files the response a supplicant gets when they are in fact a Catholic versus when they are Jewish. That's one of the things I know that the University of Munster's team is interested in. But this makes me, there are people who, my first reaction is, why should it surprise us? It wasn't a priority for the Pope. If this was the theology of the time, why is that surprising? And I find myself more and more interested in those people, and these also come up in the archives, who even at the time in 1933 and 1945 were writing to the Pope and the bishops saying, we screwed up, the church has failed, we should be saying more, we should be doing more despite the prevailing theology. And there were letters like that, some really interesting ones. So what made people like that break the mold? That's another under-researched area. But anyway, I'll be quiet now.
Well, that's just to Suzanne's point. I mean, those voices that you're mentioning, those are the voices that we also have to be listening to, because they were a minority voice. They were dissenters in a sense in the tradition, the Catholic tradition, but they're part of the same church. They're part of the same ecclesial reality. How they're engaged, again, think of it sort of as a center periphery dynamic if we want, but these sort of how that competing, sometimes those tensions or those contradictions, how that played itself out, not just at the highest level, but in the church as a global transnational community is a deeply consequential question. I'll just add, for Suzanne's point, the other thing that strikes me, and I think David may have similar observations, is just how concerned the Holy See, the Commission is with Italians, especially. And it underscores for me something that we often again forget of just how Italian an institution the Vatican was at the time. It still remains that way in lots of ways. But certainly, and it raises interesting, again, something for me is that it's a research question that I'm going to explore, because it raises all kinds of interesting questions about the true nature of the relationship between the Vatican and the regime or institutions in Italy, like the military, that were, I guess, nominally pre-fascist and non-fascist, but of course closely aligned with Mussolini's regime, at least for a long time. So,
thank you. Okay, I was thinking, connected to many of the things that you just mentioned, about a workshop that we had in Yad Vashem over 10 years ago. And some of the participants there suggested that one of the possible reasons that the Pope didn't speak clearly and publicly is that the entire Christian world was immersed in anti-Semitism, and they mentioned that the fear to split the Catholic world and therefore the entire safety of the church was maybe the reason that led to the possible decision not to openly speak on behalf of the Jews, right? And that they therefore concluded, those scholars, that if we talk about negligence, then this blame should be addressed not only to the Pope, but to the entire Catholic Church, which did not rise up to save the Jews, right? And I was wondering, to what extent do you think that the new documentation can reinforce or weaken such a conclusion? I would like your insights on that, and maybe David will start.
Well, first of all, I think it is important to realize this is not just the Roman Catholic Church. We're talking about Christianity more generally. Just been reading a bunch of the newly available documents Vatican documents having to do with the situation in Romania. There's huge correspondence, especially with the nuncio there, Casulo. And he's complaining about the Romanian Orthodox Church. I mean, it's the head of the Orthodox Church for a year, 39 or so, is actually the prime minister of Romania. And that's fiercely anti-Semitic. And so we know about people like Monsignor Tiso, who is the prime minister in Slovakia, a Roman Catholic priest who was very much behind the Holocaust in Slovakia. But it's certainly true of these other, many of these other Christian churches as well. One would have to look at the Ukrainian church and others. So that's one thing to put this in even a larger perspective. We're not just talking about the Roman Catholic Church at these issues. I think one thing I think if you ask what light the new documentation sheds on this, for me, reading the documents I've been reading over the last couple of years, it becomes clear the Pope, why didn't he denounce the Nazis? Because I think he was afraid, among other things, afraid of a schism that it would cause in the church in Germany. I mean, who were the Nazis? I mean, who were murdering all these Jews? So, a lot of them are Catholics, especially after Austria is, part of the Third Reich. If you look at the members of the SS and so on, and what percentage were Catholics, very few Germans said they were not part of a religion. They identified as Christians, whether Protestant or Catholic. And so the Pope was worried that, I think we learned this from the newly opened archives, and this is something I'm writing about in this book that'll be out in the spring. The Pope is worried that if he were to actually denounce the Nazis for what they were doing and call it what it was, it would create a split in the church in a country where, of course, the Reformation, this is also from the Rome's point of view, it's the country of the Reformation, so this is yet a new schism in the church. Just one other thing that one finds very clearly from the newly available documents, when you talk about the silence of the Pope, it didn't just begin with Rolf Hachu's book in '63. It begins practically the day after Germany invades Poland, and has nothing to do with the Jews. Initially, it's a silence of the Pope in not denouncing the Nazis for invading largely Roman Catholic Poland. And the Poles are dismayed with the Pope. And so one has to also see his silence with respect to the Holocaust and this larger question of his silence and not wanting to offend the Germans the Catholics in Germany who were largely pro-Nazi.
Yeah.
I found something very similar, and that was really a fantastic workshop. And the Roman Catholic population in 1933 was about 30%, I think. And this was a surprise to me from the first release, if you will, the 2006 documents from Pius XI, 1922 to 39. In 1931, 32, 33, the nuncio in Germany, Cesare Orsenigo, was getting letter after letter from bishops and ordinary Catholics saying, I want to be a good Catholic and I want to be a good Nazi. And I'm in a terrible position of conflict of my own conscience because the German Bishops' Conference tells me pre-1933, big important caveat, I can't be in the party. The Pope is not making a clear statement and I want to be part of this national movement. And then in private cables between the nuncio, papal diplomat Orsenigo, the German bishops, and the Secretary of State, Pacelli, future Pius XII, there is this talk that David hints to of, there are a whole lot of Catholics we will alienate if we continue putting a ban on Nazi Party membership. We need to consider lifting it, and they did in March 1933, because otherwise we're going to lose too many good Catholics of our own flock.
Rob, please.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I think I agree. And I would just add also to the, David's point about the silences, for example, I mean, even the Italian invasion of Albania earlier in very soon after Pacelli's elected, there's silence on that. So he's also very concerned about opinion in Italy, right? And what's always very clear, and I write about this again in my book, there is a Catholic criticism already in 1939 about this approach. Let's call it silence, or again, a rhetorical caution or diplomatic approach, whatever phrase or label we want to give it. So I just think just very generally, there's so many layers again, and I'm sort of following some of the questions we're getting in the chat that seem to not be necessarily addressing some of the points that we're trying to make here. Sorry to disappoint folks, although I think it seems to sort of suggest again the need to engage in these issues with an open mind. It's the question, I think, of responsibility. Ultimately, from a religious perspective, it's obvious that that responsibility for mass violence and genocide cannot be confined to religious leadership alone. It raises questions, I think, about the nature of, in this case, a transnational community. The Catholic Church is a transnational actor. It raises questions about what the Pope himself sees as his functions. And, without getting too much into the weeds here, it is perhaps the single most important job of the Pope to maintain and preserve the unity of the Catholic Church and the Catholic faithful. So it shouldn't surprise us that there is a concern there about fracturing Catholics in Germany. It may explain in part, for example, his silence vis-a-vis the Polish Catholics, who were enormously frustrated and felt abandoned, right? But the other question is about, the role that religious ideas and practices have in what other scholars have described as that process of othering, right? And of making a religious minority an other, and then, enabling, in a sense, eventual discrimination, marginalization, and as we know, once the conditions were set, displacement, deportation, and mass murder. That's, and again, this may not satisfy a lot of our listeners, as it were, but that's a hard job, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to untangle snarled threads of theology and religious belief and practice, and what's official and what's understood by ordinary people, and what is cultural prejudice and meeting official teaching. It's and then you got to get to the level of social relations on the ground, right? And it's a complex task, and which is one of the reasons why I think it's going to take a long time, and it's one of the reasons why, in lots of ways, this subject I think merits ongoing attention and research and analysis, but also some more sort of conceptual approaches to understanding more generally the question of religion and genocide, not just the Catholic Church and the Holocaust.
Thank you. Well, I see that we have many questions in the chat, but I would like still to ask one final question, actually, that takes us out from the work that we do in archives. And I would like to ponder on the question: how will research of the new documentation that we are seeing now will influence, in your opinion, the Catholic-Jewish dialogue and relationship in the future? And maybe we'll start with Rob, please.
That's a very good question. I have no unique insight. My thinking, in a way, is here, and I'll just share this, frankly and quickly. I think that sometimes the whole discussion of Catholic-Jewish dialogue has been happening at 30,000 feet, and I think it's been happening often in restricted circles. I'm wondering to what extent some of the understandings and the insights and the commitments of previous generations around Christian-Jewish dialogue and Catholic-Jewish dialogue in particular, how much of that is actually filtering down to Catholic communities today? I see, again, if I think about, for example, students that I'm teaching, I see something of a gap. And it feels sometimes that there's if, sort of there are some closed communities talking to each other, and I'm a part of that, about the same issues, and yet there seems to be a missing piece. I would just say that I have two concerns that I think are maybe connected to this. One of them is, a concern about resurgent anti-Semitism and the increasing normalization of anti-Semitism and its use in public life. There was an episode in Italy just yesterday, for example, as part of an anti-vax protest movement, which of course the radical right in Italy has embraced, where Liliana Segre, many of you know, is an Italian survivor, was publicly denounced and very essentially threatened. from a stage in a public square in Italy. And it's interesting because in some senses, this is feeding reactions in quarters of the Catholic world that are at odds with Pope Francis and are at odds with official Catholicism. So a resurgent anti-Semitism in some Catholic quarters is a concern for me. And then the other question, of course, is where are people, let's just deal in this case with Catholics, where are they going to learn about Catholic-Jewish dialogue if, for example, religious studies departments are dwindling and closing, if historical study is declining? We don't have time to get into all of those issues, but again, anecdotally, I know that several of my colleagues and I have been discussing issues around seminary formation in North America around some of these issues. So that's the question I have, is how will Catholics learn about this history and about the commitments to transforming relations between Christians and Jews? And I don't have an answer. That's a question.
Okay, Suzanne, please.
I mean, if we look at it in the most bare bones way possible, in a Christian Europe, 6 million Jews and millions of others were murdered by the Nazis and their Axis partners. Catholic teaching and theology and actions on the part of every range of behavior in the Catholic community were part of that. The church teachings until Nostra Aetate, until Vatican II, were negative towards Jews. Let's just accept those things as facts, and then let's talk about the why. Let's use the documentation over the next 5 to 10 years to really dissect what were the discussions, what were the conversations, how did we get to this point? And if you want to make the jump to the moral realm, have we as a church gotten beyond those things? Are we truly living Vatican II or not? My hope is that we just see what the documents say and accept what they say, whatever that is, and the hard stuff and the easy stuff, and just like Pope Francis said, the church should not be afraid of history.
Thank you. David.
Well, I think what we're getting at here is these issues, although they're historical, also relate very much to current tensions within the Catholic Church. And the whole movement to make a saint of Pius XII is to a considerable extent a movement of conservatives in the church who aren't happy, although I'm no great expert on this topic, others will know more, but don't seem to be that happy with Pope Francis. Certainly if one follows Twitter and look at tweets having to do with Pius XII, many will regard him as the last Pope, valid Pope. After him, the church went wrong with the Second Vatican Council, including with Nostra Aetate. And so these questions of the Holocaust and church attitudes toward the Jews historically are very much part today of tensions within the Roman Catholic Church. So when we talk about the kind of dialogue both Rob and Suzanne have mentioned needed kind of the base level, it very much involves these larger tensions within the church. We're talking within the context of discussions within the Catholic Church. So that the difficulty I mentioned early on about coming to terms with this history as reflected in the official Vatican position, we remember that there's anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and the two have nothing to do with one another, which historically makes absolutely no sense. If the Italians and even the Nazis, insofar, if you look at how they were demonizing the Jews, it wasn't their biology they were demonizing. They were demonizing for the same things that the church publications were demonizing them for up through the 1930s. So coming to terms with that for the church today seems to be made more difficult by these contemporary issues of conservatives versus so-called liberals or progressives in the church. And so I find it hard to predict, whether, if we're asking the question, whether these new archives are going to have some major impact on producing useful discussions at the base level of the church, or useful discussions in interreligious conversations between Jews and Catholics. I find that kind of difficult to predict.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Of course, I have so many other questions that I could pose you, and we could go on for many more hours, but we are just on time to leave some time for some of the questions from the audience, and there are all sorts of questions. I will, of course, not be able to read all of them, but let's concentrate on a few of them. So we have one question that asked, is if you found any record or evidence of any sermon delivered from the pulpit of any Catholic church in Poland during the period of the Holocaust, condemning the acts of violence and anti-Semitism being committed against the Jews in Poland in broad daylight and in front of everyone. Please, if any of you found any information that could answer this question.
I think that's going to be one of the many fascinating things to study. One thing about the way the Vatican archives are organized is that the nuncio to Poland, the records of those exchanges and discussions all the way through the 30s and into the war, to the extent once communications could still get going, will be there. And I think we have to look at them more carefully. There are archives in Poland, diocesan archives that would be of great interest here for these questions. I think we have to dive more into it. And this is why I say it will take some time, because take every country in Europe and you can go through their correspondence with the Holy See in those landmark years to really fulfill this picture out. So I hope someone takes it on, a scholar of Poland out there.
Okay. So maybe I'll move to the next question. I'm curious to see if any of you actually traveled to many of the cities worldwide to access the archives of individual dioceses as we did. This is a question from Gary Krupp. You may be surprised to learn that the original documents may have been sent to the Apostolic Archives, have copies of the individual the individual dioceses worldwide, all of which have been available for decades. If any of you would like to refer to this question, comment.
Not sure I understand. So the question is, have we traveled to every diocese? What's the question?
I guess that's what it refers to.
If the point is that, I mean, I think actually it just sort of makes a point that we've all made, which is that the research in the Vatican has to be triangulated if we want to try to understand the bigger story of what the Catholic Church, again, understanding it's not a monolithic entity. So I'm catching myself even as I'm saying it, right? Because we speak of it as if it's one entity, and it is, but it's really a series of diffused communities, right? And so, but one of the things that Gary's question actually raises is a methodological, practical challenge. One of the reasons why this kind of research is hard is because it's expensive and it's timely and it's time consuming, right? So, I mean, I don't know if that's what he's really getting at, but it's just an observation that I have.
I think, one thing it brings up is that we talk about the Vatican archives, but if you talk about the ecclesiastical archives, you're talking about hundreds or obviously thousands of potential archives. Every diocese, even every parish has some kind of archive. Plus all the religious communities. I mean, the Jesuit archives have opened in January for the papacy of Pius XII. They haven't been totally cataloged, but they're incredibly valuable for these kinds of questions that we're talking about. Then there's, for me, a particularly painful subject of the Cardinal Vicar archives of Rome, which are very important. And the Cardinal Vicar of Rome traditionally was kind of responsible for the Jews of Rome. And those archives theoretically should be open, but they're not open. We don't have access to them. So, those 9 months, for example, of German occupation in Rome, it would be really interesting to read what one could find in the Cardinal Vicar of Rome's archives at St. John of Lateran Church, but we have no access to them. So the question of the diocese, what we find there is, as I think was implied in the question, that some were kind of laissez-faire and they probably were open even before Francis authorized the opening for that papacy, whereas others are still not open and some are just not cataloged, some have no staff. So there are a million reasons good and bad why scholars may not have access to what could be very valuable material.
Right.
May I just really quickly, because I feel strongly, I think that we would be doing a disservice to colleagues, and I think Rebecca, this conference itself, that this precedes a gathering, a workshop where new ideas and new research is going to be featured. There is a lot of work done about the Catholic Church and the Holocaust.
Yeah.
There is work done, for example, on religious communities, women, especially female religious communities. There is work done in diocesan archives from various parts of Europe. There is work done on, I mean, I could go on and on and on. The question is, are people of good faith really willing to engage that research? And that's good. So it takes time, but the work is there. And I think we're doing a disservice to the field if we don't acknowledge that. Right? It's not prominent, but it's there in many cases.
Yeah, I think you're making a very good point. There are a multitude of scholars all around the world that are doing actually this kind of research. But I think that the last part of the question, that all these archives have been available for decades, I am not sure that is totally correct. I think that most of them have been becoming available and open to researchers only recently, and that's why we see recently many more scholars going and doing research. But as you all said several times during this evening, it takes time. Serious research takes time, and we will see the fruit of this research in years to come. Allow me to move to another question. From Patricia Fayer. Has anyone found documents bearing on Spanish-Argentine efforts to provide a network for Nazis to escape Europe? If any of you would like to relate to it.
Well, there is, well, maybe Suzanne, I haven't found much. It's one I've been myself concentrating on the war years for this book I've been working on, but I haven't heard of anything coming to light that sheds dramatic new light on the so-called round line, but I'm sure many folks will be interested to look into that. I don't know, Suzanne, have you come across anything?
I think that's another one of the great unfully answered questions. I won't say unanswered because obviously we know a lot, but I know Philip Sands is working on a book right now about the escape network in Latin America and exactly how that functioned. Those records, those are going to take a little more work to find. And for example, in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, the biggest one, if one looks in the Pontifical Assistance Commission finding aid, and these Pontifical Assistance Commissions were often pathways for Nazis posing as regular displaced persons. The descriptions are such that it's going to take a researcher some time to really go file by file to find something interesting. So I think that's one of those areas where 10 years from now we'll be having a really rich conversation, and right now we're still trying to figure out what's in there.
Thank you. David, you raised the curiosity of several listeners who asked, what were you referring to about popes dealing with Hitler, and the new documentation that you found about the relationship between Pius XII and Hitler? So please.
I was hoping you weren't going to ask that question, actually. The problem is it's sort of an awkward one. I just completed this book called The Pope and War, about this history. And it'll be out in June in the US, then in the fall in Italy. And this is kind of one of the big revelations of the book. So my editor at Random House has said, whatever you do not talk about
this.
Do
not talk about it.
So yeah, I hate to be, kind of teaser on this issue, but
okay.
I would just, just to be a little bit more transparent, it had to do with negotiations going on between the Pope and Hitler beginning very shortly after Pacelli became Pope. But I wanted to write this up because I thought it was so striking for a separate piece that could come out more quickly. But again, my editor thought, no, this was something that should be in the book and new there. So instead, I'm kind of in this awkward situation we often find ourselves on the one hand, says scholar, I want to immediately share all this. On the other hand, as the author of a book, I feel a little bit bashful about it.
So we'll have to wait patiently, and
I'll be happy
we'll have to
June
read the book.
7th to discuss this fully with anybody.
Thank you, David. Another question says that from my very limited knowledge, it seems to me that Pius XI would have acted differently than Pius XII. How important are personal views of the popes versus the view of the Vatican establishment? Please, if somebody wants to relate to it.
That one's for you, David. You wrote a whole book on that.
Yeah, well, Pius XI. So Pius XI, too, of course, was steeped in the prevailing negative views of Jews that was in the church as he was a young priest and so on. On the other hand, first of all, he was a very different personality than Pacelli, very different family background, very different personality. He was a man who spoke his mind, who was not all that diplomatic, who had a temper, who felt very strongly about the prerogatives of the church and about, the certain kind of moral view of the position of the church. And in his last year or so of his papacy, he died in early February of 1939. So in that last year, I think he began to have second thoughts about the kind of deal he had made with Mussolini, and in particular being angered by Mussolini's embrace of Hitler. This is something I think a lot of people don't understand. They talk about the relationship of the popes to the totalitarian regimes, or Hitler's pope and so on. The fact is, there's a totally different view that both Pius XI and Pius XII had a very negative view of Hitler and of Nazism, which they saw as chipping away at the influence of the church in Germany. Whereas the fascist regime in Italy was seen as a big boost for the church and the influence and the position of the church in Italy. So, I wrote a book called The Pope and Mussolini that came out a few years ago. And there I tried to, with the opening just now 15 or 20 years ago 15 years ago, the archives of the previous papacy, Pius XI, we can now document how people around Pius XI, including his number two, his Secretary of State Pacelli, were cautioning him not to speak out, to denounce to Mussolini and his embrace of Hitler. As we read not so much the Vatican archives that are open, but if you read the French diplomatic correspondence, the British, American diplomatic correspondence, they'll all talk about during the war about how they think it would have been different if Pius XI was Pope. That Pius XI would not have kept silent. I mean, this was the opinion expressed in those, if you read the diplomatic archives, by the French ambassadors, for example, as well as the British envoy. So I think there is reason. Now, what difference that would have made is a whole other question, but there was certainly this sense that Pius XI would not have remained quiet.
Thank you. And there is here a question from Dan Michman. Dr. Ventresca makes the distinction between the historical and moral, but isn't it more a distinction between our view of Pius XII and the Vatican as a political institution, which will allow for leniency in the evaluation of the policies conducted vis-a-vis the very complicated situation, versus viewing him as a moral authority who has to act beyond common politics, which then leads to a more critical evaluation? Rob, would you like to refer to it, or somebody else?
I think I understand the spirit of the question, but I mean, it's interesting that you introduced the concept of political leniency. So you're suggesting, I mean, I think to me immediately when I hear that, I hear a judgment. You made a judgment about my position, for example, because perhaps the argument is heading in a direction that with which one doesn't agree. I'm not quite sure if the problem is, I think trying to understand a man like Pius XII or Pius XI, for that matter, on their own terms, I don't think, for example, that he thought of the church as a political institution, which isn't to say that he didn't think it had a place and a voice. The whole tension, even the difference between those two popes, for example, was how best to represent and reflect those interests in the political sphere, in the diplomatic sphere. So I don't know that I disagree with that at all on the question, but I don't know that, I still think that the question of what we think the Pope should have done is an ethical and moral question, and it's an important question. And I'm not suggesting we don't ask it. But we often talk about the process of truth and reconciliation and various other dynamics. But I guess what I'm saying simply there is the truth part has to come first. So the truth seeking and the truth telling has to come first, to the extent that we, and historians and scholars are uniquely informed because we have access to this information to then sort of make some of those judgments. But I'm sure I've answered the question satisfactorily, but I'm not sure I also see the same distinction there.
Okay.
I mean, I think about this from the documents at the time. Pius XI and XII were getting all kinds of correspondence from other heads of state, because the Vatican is a city-state and they're head of a city-state and they're making political decisions. And then they're getting hundreds of thousands of letters from Jews, from Catholics, appealing to these two men as vicars of Christ on earth, as God's representative on earth. Can we reconcile those two roles? Is it possible to be both of those things? Or should we at least not consider acknowledging the limitations? And I think I'm trying to say what Rob said. Let's just look at what they did and why on the face of it, and then think about that question. Can you be the vicar of Christ on earth and can you be the head of a city-state at the same time? Is that possible without somebody dropping a ball?
I think, this is probably some of the animus behind some of the Jewish community's concern about the effort to make a saint of Pius XII, that if you have a political judgment about the role of the Pope as the head of this huge international organization, you could have, at least from my perspective now, taking the moral perspective on the historians, could say he was a great success. I mean, the church did not split in Germany, for example. In Italy, the deal that the Vatican worked out with Mussolini that restored their power and ended separation of church and state and so on, that was kept in the post-war constitution. The idea that the church had been anti-fascist began to be held up by Italians, along with their general idea that they themselves had never been fascists, of course. So that's, a political kind of judgment I think you could make, say he was quite successful, that what he set out to do was successful. What kind of grates, though, is that at the same time, as Suzanne was mentioning, he's presented, they have this film, PR film that comes out in the middle of the war, Pastor Angelicus, presenting him as a great moral leader, Prince of Peace. And that, that's a whole other set of issues. And if we were to judge him on those grounds, I think one could well come up with a very different judgment, that is success or failure.
Okay, unfortunately, the time is running short, but I would like to maybe to read one or two more questions. Alex Sternberg is asking, please, can you describe what the archives reveal regarding Pius' attitude toward the destruction of the Jews? If you found any new insights in the documentation.
I mean, I think that, first of all, we can't answer the question definitively. We can only talk about examples we've seen so far. I've not yet come across any examples where Pius XI or XII was glorying in or happy about violence against Jews. That's not to say they didn't weigh it and then make a trade-off. I don't think, I've not yet seen instances where this was something that was good news for them. The traditional views of Jews as a religion to be tolerated, but not considered equal, I think really still held, from what I have seen so far, held. But again, we need to take our time in the next 5 or 10 years and see if a new vantage point comes out.
Well, I think, the attitude toward the Jews of the popes, the racial laws, anti-Semitic laws that were being put, not just in the famous Nuremberg laws of 35 in Germany, but the 38 racial laws in Italy, and and Hungary and Poland and so many of the countries of Europe, and this is before the Holocaust, this is the second half of the 30s, basically, as these are coming in, it's pretty clear they were strongly supported by the Catholic Church. What wasn't supported by the Vatican certainly was the mass murder of the Jews. So we have to make that distinction. And so when we say violence against Jews, no, I mean, this was always the position, at least at the time, the position of the church. The Jews should not be allowed to have equal rights with Christians. That would be dangerous to Christians. We were against the emancipation of the Jews in the 19th century, and nothing's changed our mind in the 20th. But that it's not good to go around, murdering Jewish children and old people and so forth. That said, of course, the most dramatic instance for Pius XII here was when over 1,000 Jews of Rome were rounded up. It's almost the anniversary, October 16th, 1943.
Yesterday.
And he did not speak out, even though the Rome's Jews, they were often referred to as the Pope's Jews, that historically the popes had a certain kind of responsibility for the Jews of Rome. So, he was not happy, obviously, about the fact they were all put on a train 2 days later and sent directly to Auschwitz, where the great majority of them were gassed upon entry a week later. So was he happy about that? No, I'm sure he was quite upset, and for two reasons. One, as a human being, but also because it made him look bad. So, I think we do need to make that distinction between they wouldn't call persecution of Jews, but I think treating Jews as not giving Jews the same rights as other Christian citizens, this was a position of the church. So in that sense, persecution of the Jews was the favored position of the Vatican, but not violence against Jews.
You do have to ask what impact that had. I mean, I often think of in working at the museum 2 decades now and reading stories from survivors for the Jewish child who is separated from their parent, and their parent is then gassed and they never see their parent or extended family again. They aren't so interested in whether how we got to this moment or whether things went too far. They're just watching their loved ones being murdered. And so I do think sometimes that question comes up a lot in these discussions. And I do wonder sometimes about its utility, and I guess what I'm trying to say is, let's think about where an ideology like the Catholic Church had until the Second Vatican Council contributed to what happened.
Thank you. I would like to, first of all, to apologize that we don't have, unfortunately, enough time to read the many, many questions, very interesting questions that the public wrote to us. And I would like, secondly, to thank my colleagues here for a fascinating discussion and a lot of new insights. And I think that what we all understand is that we have to be patient. We have to let scholars do their work, their serious, honest work, and it will take time until step by step, piece by piece, we will have some more information and some more insights. Yet I'm not sure that we will dramatically change much of what we know today, but definitely we'll have many more books and articles, interesting, fascinating ones to read. And the first one being the one of David, that we are all looking forward to reading it. So thank you very much. And I'm giving back the microphone to Ruth, please.
And I want to thank our panelists again. I want to remind the audience that we can be very, very impatient about wanting results when there are millions, literally, of documents that
15 million.
15 million, and that's just at the Vatican. And as we're reminded, there are archives spread throughout the Catholic world, which are also relevant. So this 5 to 10 years is probably just the beginning of the road. But we need to maybe say that we will try to look forward to reconvening a panel of this sort in 5 years, maybe 10 years, and be able to provide something more of an update, nuances on what's been said now, certainly more certainty as we move on with our learning. So thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much to Iael for running the discussion, which I think was very, very enlightening. A virtual clapping, a virtual applause to everybody. And we look forward to seeing those of you who are involved in the Scholars Conference tomorrow at 11 o'clock Eastern Time. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.